Chapter 14 is about factoring. So anytime you are factoring, your first step would always be to factor out the greatest common factor, which we call the GCF for short, assuming that there is a GCF to factor out. All right, so a lot of people confuse the greatest common factor with like the least common multiple or the least common denominator. Okay, so it's kind of like the opposite of finding the least common denominator. You're finding what goes in to both of these two terms here. So in this case, the greatest common factor is going to be 2c. All right, so we're going to factor out the greatest common factor, which is 2c. So anytime that you're factoring, you're just rewriting this expression, this polynomial expression. Okay, so the answer that we're going to be writing down is going to be equal to the original that we started with. It's just going to be in factored form, so it's just going to look a little bit different, but it's still going to be equal to the same thing. So start by writing down the GCF in the front, and then we're going to have open parentheses here, and we're going to divide the original problem. We're going to divide each term by that GCF. Okay, so basically what we're doing here is we're multiplying by 2c, but at the same time we're also dividing by 2c. So that's why it's still equal to the original. The value of it hasn't actually changed. So keep that 2c in the front, and then let's reduce. 2's cancel out. One of the c's cancels out, so that's just c. And then 2c divided by 2c is just going to be equal to 1. Okay, and that's our final answer. So if you were to multiply this back out, so in other words, you were distribute this, it would equal what we started with. You would see that it would be the same. All right, so number 2, the GCF, so the biggest number that will go into both 18 and 27 is going to be 9. Then let's look at the variables. Okay, so they each have at least a W, and they each have at least one Z. Okay, so my GCF is 9WZ. So when I factor it, it's going to equal 9WZ. And then just take these original terms here and divide each one by the GCF. So keep that GCF in the front. So 9 goes into 18 2 times, and then WZ just cancels out. 9 goes into 27 3 times, and one of the W's will cancel out and the Z's will cancel out. So you're left with 3W. Okay, and that's our final answer. And again, if you were to distribute that, you would see that it's the same as that. All right, number 3, the GCF is 2x. All right, so when it comes to the variables, if they all have a variable in common, you're just going to go with the least power of that variable. So in this case, just the power of 1. So put that GCF in the front, and take the original problem, And divide each term by the GCF. Keep that GCF in the front and reduce. So 2 goes into 8 4 times. And then that's like an invisible exponent of 1 there on the x. So 3 minus 1 is 2, so that'll be 4x squared minus, so 2 goes into 10 5 times. And then one of the x's cancels out, and it's 5x minus 2 goes into 14 7 times. X cancels all the way out. And that's my final answer. Number 4, GCF is going to be, I believe that's going to be 9 for the number. And then they all have x in them. The lowest exponent of x is 2. So it's 9x squared is the GCF. So write that in the front. And then we're going to divide each of these terms by that. Keep that GCF in the front. So 9 goes into 36 4 times, and then 6 minus 2 is 4, so it's 4x to the 4th, plus 9 goes into 45 5 times, and then 4 minus 2 is 2, so that's 5x squared, minus 9 goes into 18 2 times, and then the x squared cancels all the way out. And that's my final answer right there. And number 5, let's find the GCF. So the numbers don't have any common factors. And the only letter they have in common is B. And the smallest power of b is 2. They all have at least b squared. All right. So we're going to take each of these terms. We're going to divide each one of them by b squared. So keep that b squared in the front. All right. So the only thing that's going to change is the b. So it's still going to be 2a and then b plus 3x, and then the b squared cancels all the way out, minus 5. 4 minus 2 is 2, so that's b squared, plus 2, and the b squared cancels all the way out on that one. And then this is my final answer. All right. Alrighty. Number 6, the GCF would be 7, and then they each have an A. They each have at least one B, and they each have at least one C. So 7ABC is the GCF. Then we're going to take each of these terms. So that's 35abc squared minus 49ab squared c. Divide each of those by 7abc. So keep the 7abc in the front. And then 7 goes into 35 5 times. A cancels and B cancels. And all we have left for is the C. Minus 7 goes into 49 7 times. A cancels. There's a B left and C cancels. So 7B is what we have there. All right, so number 7. So in this case, this looks a little bit different, but it's still kind of the same. So in this case, let's look at it as this is one term and this is another term, okay? That's one term and that's another term. So what do those two terms have in common? Well, it's going to be the thing that's in parentheses, which is 3a plus b. All right, so just like before, we're going to write that 3a plus b in the front. And then we're going to take each of these. We're going to divide each of those two terms by the 3a plus b. So then 3a plus b cancels out. So you still have the 3a plus b in the front. And then we're just left with 6 minus z here. Okay, and that is it for that one. Number 8, it's kind of the same thing. So if 5x times x minus 7 is one term and 3 times x minus 7 is the second term, so what do those have in common? That's going to be x minus 7. That's your GCF. And then all right, so keep that x minus 7 in the front. Cancel out x minus 7 here and there. And then we're just left with 5x plus 3. And that's our final answer for that. Okay. Number 9, kind of the same thing. So if we look at, that's one term and that's one term. What they have in common is the part that's in parentheses, which is 3y plus 5z. So write that down out here. Okay, now that next step, I usually don't write out that whole next step, and you can if you want to, or you don't necessarily have to. It's up to you. It's helpful to do that if it's a new concept for you. I know personally for me, I used to do this and I really didn't even know what I was doing. I didn't ever think about the fact that I'm multiplying by the GCF and I'm dividing by the GCF. And it wasn't until I started actually teaching this that I even thought to even describe it that way and realize that's what was happening. But I mean, most of the time I'm just like, all right, well, what if I take that out of here? What do I have left? Well, I just have left 7x because I took that out, and I take that out, so now I have minus 6t. Oops. And that's it. Okay, number 10. All right, so let's see. All right, so that's the first term. That's the second term. What do they have in common? It's going to be the part that's in the parentheses, which is c plus 4d. All right, so I'm not going to skip that step this time. I'm going to go ahead and write it out again. C plus 4d plus 7c squared times c plus 4d. All right, and divide each term by c plus 4d. All right, so keep that c plus 4d in the front. All right, now the reason why I wanted to go ahead and write it out again this time is because one of the most common mistakes I'll see here is just you're thinking, okay, well, this is gone. It's nothing. Well, it's not nothing. It's c plus 4d divided by c plus 4d. So that is equal, anything divided by itself is always equal to 1. All right, so that is going to be equal to 1. Okay, and then cancel that out and you got plus 7c squared. And there we go. Okay, so watch out for that common mistake. All right. So that leads us to factoring by grouping. All right, so this is a method for factoring that we use whenever we see 4 terms, okay? Factor it by grouping. Okay, so grouping means that I'm going to take the first 2 terms and I'm going to group those together. So that's one group. And then take the last 2 terms and group those together. Then I'm going to take each group and I'm going to factor out a GCF. So with the first group, my GCF would be x. So write it down, open parentheses. Okay, and then I'm going to divide that term by x. I'm going to divide that term by x, right? So xy divided by x, the x would cancel. Now just bring down the y. And then x divided by x is 1. And then for the second group, the GCF is 4. So I'm going to bring down the plus. My GCF is 4, so I write that down, open parentheses, and then I divide that term by 4 and that term by 4. So 4 cancels out, it leaves with y minus 4 divided by 4 is 1. All right, and then now I'm going to look at it like here's one term and here's another term, and what do those 2 terms have in common? Well, what they have in common is y minus 1. That's now my GCF. So write down your GCF first. Okay, now what if you divide this term by y minus 1 and you divide that term by y minus 1? Well, y minus 1 cancels out and you just have an x there plus, on the next one, y minus 1 cancels out there also, and you bring down the 4. And that's your answer. Okay, and you could FOIL this. When you're grouping, you can always multiply to check your answer. So you could FOIL this and it would equal, you would see that it would be the same as what you started with. Okay, number 12. So we're going to factor it by grouping. So x cubed minus 6x squared is the first group. And then 2x minus 12 is the second group. So the GCF from the first group would be x squared. So if you divide that by x squared, x cubed divided by x squared is x. And if you divide that by x squared, the x squared would cancel out. That would be minus 6. And then bring down the plus sign. So the GCF for the second group is 2. So write down your GCF, open parentheses, divide that by 2. The 2's cancel. So that would just bring down the x. Divide that by 2, and that would be negative 6. Okay. So now your GCF is x minus 6. So you write that down. So if you divide that by x minus 6 and the x minus 6 cancels out, then you can bring down the x squared plus, and if you divide this by x minus 6, the x minus 6 cancels out, and you can bring down the 2, and that's your final answer. All right, number 13. We have 4 terms, so we're factoring it by grouping again. So 4x plus 8y is the first group, and the GCF from that group would be 4. So write down your GCF, open parentheses, 4x divided by 4 is x, plus 8y divided by 4 would be 2y. Close the parentheses. Okay, and then your second group would be this. All right, so your GCF is going, because of the fact that this is negative right here, I'm going to say that my GCF is negative. Okay, my GCF is going to be negative 3W. So there, wrote down my GCF, open the parentheses, divide this by negative 3W. So the negative cancels out, 3W cancels out. All you have left to bring down from that term is an x. And then divide the next term by negative 3W. So again, the negatives would cancel out. So that would make that a plus. And then 6 divided by 3 is 2. The w's would cancel out, and I'd bring down the y and close the parentheses there. Okay, so now my GCF is x plus 2y. So I will write down my GCF in the front, and then if I divide that by x plus 2y, I'll have the 4 to bring down. And if I divide this by x plus 2y, I'll have minus 3w to bring down. And that will be my final answer. Okay, number 14. Again, I have 4 terms, so I'm going to factor it by grouping. You always still want to check to see if you have a greatest common factor, which we don't, so that's cool. And then since we have 4 terms, we're going to factor it by grouping. So the first group is x squared minus 4x, and the GCF for that group is going to be x. So the GCF for that first group is x squared. So we're going to write that down. Sorry, it's not x squared, silly. It's just x. Just x. Okay, and then divide that by x, divide that by x. So that would be x minus 4. Okay, and then the second group is that. So the GCF for that one is going to be 3. Write down that GCF, parentheses, divide that by 3, that'll just be x. Divide that by 3, and then that'll be minus 4. Okay, then now our GCF is x minus 4. So write that down, open parentheses. So if we divide this by x minus 4, then we'll just be able to bring down that x. And if we divide the other term by x minus 4, we're just going to bring down that 3. And that's our final answer right there. Number 15, same thing. Now you almost might think we had a GCF for the whole problem, but we don't because this one doesn't have any 3. So we couldn't factor out like a 3 or a y because that one doesn't have a y. So no GCF, but you do want to, this is a good idea to check at the beginning of each factoring problem if there happens to be a GCF for the whole problem. All right then, so that's the first group. So the GCF for that group is y. So if you divide that by y, you have 3y. If you divide that by y, you have minus 1. And then the second group, so the GCF for the second group is 3. Divide that by 3, that's 3y. Divide that by 3, that's minus 1. Now your GCF is 3y minus 1, so write that down. And when you factor that out, you're going to be left with y plus 3. And that's the final answer for that. Number 16. The GCF for the first group is x, and that leaves, when you divide that out, x minus 2 in the parentheses. And then again, we have a minus right there, so we're going to say that our next GCF is a negative, so it's going to be negative y. So divide that by negative y, so that would just leave x, because the negative would cancel out and the y would cancel out. And then divide this by negative y. So that's a positive divided by a negative. So that's going to be negative, and the y will cancel out, and it'll just leave the 2. Okay, then x minus 2 is now the GCF. And when we factor that out, we're left with x minus y. All right, and you can always FOIL any of these, and it should look like what you started with if it's the correct answer. All right, and that's the end of 14.1.